Thank you, everybody, for coming back to the final session here of this workshop, and I'm really excited for this session since this is a topic close to my heart on workforce development and training. I am delighted to introduce Tom Bullenbach, Chief Technology Officer of Biofab USA and Army, which is one of the National Manufacturing Innovation Institutes funded through the Department of Defense. And he has assembled a great group of government and industry leaders and who will talk about the issue of training and workforce development in the regenerative medicine space. Tom?
Thanks, Krish, and I'm happy to welcome you to this panel on education and workforce development. Usually these EWD panels focus on the need for a manufacturing and quality workforce, the shortage of which we're all very acutely aware of, especially in industry. But like many of you, we at Army Biofab USA have also felt acutely the need for a trained workforce to operate in this new analytical and data-rich environment, which we're focusing on today. I also want to add that we've mentioned a bunch of times throughout the 2 days here, the idea of developing the leaders of tomorrow. And that should include influencing those scientists and engineers as they move into leadership positions to underscore to the broader community and especially to investors in their companies the importance of this type of data-rich R&D while still moving at breakneck speed into clinical trials. And from a manufacturing perspective, I personally want a future that includes a generation of scientists and engineers who stop saying the process is the product and start saying this process is the product. But we also know that these others are too, because we have a robust understanding of and are well informed by data. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll introduce you by name and affiliation, but I encourage you to weave your background and your current work into the discussion with examples. And I also encourage you to jump in and engage each other as the opportunity arises. So with us today are John Balchunas, Workforce Director at the National Institute for Innovation in Manufacturing Biopharmaceuticals, or NIMBLE, a fellow MII. Allison Gammy, Director of Training, Workforce Development and Diversity at the National Institute of General Medical Sciences at the NIH. Don Tilbury, Assistant Director of Engineering at the NSF. And Robert Zambon, Senior Director, Data Strategy and External Innovation at Johnson & Johnson. Thanks for all of you for being here today. So I just want to start off with a fairly general but maybe multi-layered question, and that's, what are some of the important workforce development challenges with regard to data science, AI, computational biology training that we need to think about? And maybe I'll turn it to John first to kick us off, but again, I encourage all the panelists to dive right in.
Sure. So thanks, Tom. And I appreciate at the beginning of the panel you acknowledged that we're all familiar with the need for more just manufacturing talent and quality talent. I think it's something that we hear constantly from from our member organizations within NIMBLE, and I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different angle. Being biopharma, not regenerative medicine. That said, I think the needs are all the same. The challenges are all the same. So I think it's still it's really one big thing. I think when I look at the challenges, with respect to data, automation, computational biology, and all that, and how sort of systems thinking in general is changing, sort of the workforce development dynamic. I think it's really in a couple different factors. I think on the one hand, it's obviously the need to be retraining or upskilling the existing workforce, because you're not talking about technicians that are doing the same thing every day and routinely just doing the same operations. You're talking about technicians that now need to interact with data and respond to data and know what to do in response to certain things. And so and then at the scientist level, you're talking about people that can interface with a lot of different types of people. And so it's moving from a modality of I guess sort of or it's moving to a modality of more jack of all trades, master of one, in a way that you need people that can talk to the multidisciplinary crowd that the industry is becoming. And I think on the other hand, obviously, it's how does the industry, and I think the biggest challenge that I think I really see is how does the industry attract that multidisciplinary talent? We're not talking about attracting more and more chemical engineers and molecular biologists. We're talking about how do you attract data scientists and analytics people, and how do you get PhDs and bachelor degree students interested in regenerative medicine, interested in biopharma, that these are students that typically have Google and Facebook and Oracle on the radar screen. How do you attract them to the industry? And I think that's still remains a key challenge.
And Allison, you had some definite thoughts in our call last week on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I think one of the things that we see is that students get pulled out even before they complete their degree sometimes to a high-paying job. And I think in particular, if you look at student loan debt, that makes those jobs all the more attractive. So I think that solutions need to really think about the debt burden that students are carrying and think about creative ways to maybe help out with that to keep them in the pathway. And I think on top of that, that adds a dimension of diversity where there's a lot of data that says that underrepresented minorities in particular have a disproportionate debt load. So I think I would just add to what you said and just add that extra piece.
So maybe I can follow on to that because I think the debt load is really important. But I also think to try to sell to the students that working in this area is really important for society and how the accomplishments that they make as data scientists in these types of industries where you're building solutions that can save people's lives are really having a high societal impact. So I think trying to convince students, maybe do a little better job of marketing that yes, you could be a data scientist at Google and build a better ad recommender form, or you could be a data scientist in a pharmaceutical company and help save lives. And I think trying to sell that story to students can really have an impact, especially with diverse students. They tend to have, research has shown, more affinity to jobs that really have impact on people's lives.
Dawn, I was just going to say as an aside, I think I'm really glad you mentioned that because we always forget that, in biopharma and regenerative medicine in this whole space, there's an easy sell there. I mean, from a meaning standpoint, when you look at this generation, of talent that's coming out of schools, they're looking for jobs with meaning. Our industry screams meaning. And I think we always get hung up on this notion that, manufacturing isn't sexy and it's a challenge to try and recruit students into this space. But I think in the reality, if we flip it around and realize our industry screams meaning, and I think it's just how do we better communicate that?
Yeah, I think, agree with everything that everybody said already. I think one of the key components of this too, it's interesting a lot that from different discussions that I've had, different panels and a lot of different workshops, the point always comes up from the perspective of we need to convince data scientists to work and analysts and AI and ML machine learning experts to work in pharma. I think the counterpoint is also true in that people that are in biology, chemistry, things along those lines, those different programs right now need to be recruited into data science programs also. So they're starting out with that interest in that area, and we need to start pulling them in and having them get that training while they're still in a university or even earlier to understand what the possibility there is. Because when a lot of these people look at it right now, it's okay, I can become a data scientist and go work at Google, or any kind of AI and ML machine learning type person, or I can go into pharma. And they view it as a lot of times two different branches. And as we continue to educate not only those that are right now training to enter the workforce, but those even prior to that, and help that become more reality and what that actually means and what that could be from a career perspective, I think that'll help shift the balance towards what we're looking for. It all kind of comes together in that regard. I think one other quick comment on this too is, and this will flow into some of the other topics we're going to talk about, is focusing not just on trying to create polymaths that can do everything and understanding where that level of potential training can go to and what's reasonable and what's not. Everybody always wants to find the purple unicorn that can do everything, but that's not always the best approach sometimes to staff out people. And trying to look at how we can build teams is some way just as important as how we can build up that one person.
Well, Bob, I think go ahead, Tom.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's interesting. You said that, we don't want to go out and create a bunch of polymaths. And I think that's sort of where the challenge is, I think, in trying to figure out what's sort of that level, what's that foundational level of knowledge that you need to equip people at different levels, so technicians, scientists, engineers, with about these different disciplines that they're going to have to interface with. Because, on the one hand, they don't need to be a polymath, but they absolutely need to know something about everything. And how do you, it's somewhat of a paradigm shift in a way, in terms of the way we're educating people.
I'll also add they need to learn how to speak a few words of other languages so they can try to interface at that between chemistry, biology, data analytics, computer science, because different disciplines have different languages. And if you have that language barrier, even though they're all speaking English, it can be really hard to make progress. So giving them the experience to try to talk to people across different disciplines, I think is really eye-opening and can make progress when they start to work together on problems.
It's that lingua franca that we've been talking about ever since Amy said it yesterday. We've been saying that we need to be able to speak each other's languages, and that's totally true. Does this feel to anyone like genomics and bioinformatics felt at the end of the 90s? Maybe there's something we could learn there. Dawn, I'm sure that NSF had quite a bit of experience with that at that time, right?
So I wasn't there at NSF in that time, but I will say NSF has always been really interested in trying to look at the interface between different disciplines and how to bring the different disciplines together to solve real specific challenges. We call this convergence research, where multiple disciplines come together, learn each other's languages, tools and methods and data, and potentially even create new disciplines. I think bioinformatics is a good example of a new discipline that emerged when biology and information theory kind of came together. And we're seeing that more and more all the time. And so one thing we do to try to facilitate that is create workshops, bring faculty together, give them the time and the space they need to learn those other languages. I can tell you a story. Once I was writing a proposal with a friend in psychology, and I drew a picture of a variable that changed over time, and she was shocked, because to her, variables don't change over time. I'm like, well, of course they do. That's why they're variable. But, the difference between a metric and a variable, it's English, but they have very different meanings, and trying to dig down and think about what the real issue is can be eye-opening.
Bob, you were going to weigh in on this too, I think.
Yeah, I think, back up to that specific point. What was your specific question? I want to make sure I answer that and not just go off.
Well, I think this sort of relates to the question of, that was posed, which was what specific steps can be taken to help biologists have a greater appreciation and understanding for the physical sciences. And it's interesting that this is worded this way a priori, because it's obvious from the talks we had that the physicists here already have all the bio figured out. But how do we develop those relationships? Dawn made a good point, but how do we think about that?
So it's a great area, and I was thinking about this particular question for a while. It ties back a lot, as you were mentioning, tying back into our own experiences. I've worked with stem cells and tissue products, worked into data science, and kind of evolved through my career, coming from the biology background into the data science background, and have built teams and individuals around this and that evolution. And what it normally is it doesn't start with saying, I'm going to train you to do this. A lot of times when somebody's already out there in the workforce, it's putting the team together and having an expert in one area, so an expert physicist working with a biologist, and both of them at the same time focusing on similar goals, if not the exact same goal, and being able to coordinate and work with each other. Part of that comes out from developing the same language and being able to understand each other, even sometimes using the same terms and having them mean completely different things within different disciplines. So what I've found is putting those teams together, and a lot of the experience that I've had is specifically around data science and bringing in math experts, things along those lines, computer science experts, to be able to work with the biologists, with genomics people and things along like that, to have them build out new capabilities. And what happens there is some people jump over the line. I always like to look at the scale in a continuum, even though there's multiple variables that are there, of how experienced someone is. And the teams start to come together, the people start to come together to a point where they should be versus where you may want to force them to be. And then they start to fill those gaps in places that otherwise wouldn't be able to be there. So I think it's really just an exposure perspective. We do a lot of that with fellowship programs, with the ability to take sabbaticals, with engaging with both graduates and undergraduate research programs so that they can start to get that exposure there. But then we also try to build it in through the ability to rotate through different internal and external organizations as part of your career development trajectory.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
I can comment from, again, with that same general approach of, you're bringing people from different expertise and forcing them to work together essentially in, in a project setting. The same happens at some of the more innovative, universities within an academic setting as well. And I see, so within NIMBL's fold, I can look at a number of, our different member universities, and down, for example, where I'm at NC State. I run a professional development program at BTEC, the Biomanufacturing Training and Education Center. A lot of the courses that we run for undergraduates, what ends up being situational is bringing, engineers and engineering undergraduates into those classes, along with the life science engineering graduates. And so you've got this heterogeneous crowd, in a class, and they're working together on stuff, and they're coming from completely different backgrounds. Some of them know the biology, some of them don't. Some of them don't have an engineering, perspective, and some of them don't. And they're all having to learn the same content and take the same approach. And I think it's been really effective, there and at other schools.
Yeah. So I guess a related question is, how can the industry, and maybe even thinking about regulators, better prepare their workforce for systems thinking in regenerative medicine? So at some point, we're going to come to the regulators with a ton of data. How do we prepare them? And I know that, I'm always intimidated by Malcolm Moose's ability to discuss mathematics and attractor states and things like that. And so it's obvious that FDA is tuned into this, for example, but how do we prepare them? What's the mechanism that we can interact with the regulatory agencies to make sure that they're ready to receive all this? Wow, that's a Bob.
I'll jump in here if nobody else wants to, and then hopefully others will as well. I think it's frequent engagement, basically, as we continue from a industry perspective. It's frequent engagement, both in forums such as this, and also directly around the programs that we have moving forward from a regenerative medicine perspective, from novel approaches, leveraging data kind of across the board. I don't think it's going to be unique to just regenerative medicine, but I think it's definitely applicable with regenerative medicine in and of itself being so complex, and a lot of additional issues that just don't exist with some of the more straightforward therapeutics from an MOA perspective. So I think it's that engagement, frequent meetings. It's also working around the edges so that you're starting to have those relationships develop with the different programs that are instituted at regulatory agencies more broadly, so that it's not just, here's my product, here's how we're doing something, and that's the first time that maybe the FDA, someone at the FDA sees it or they're familiar with it, but instead they're being exposed to that through people as they come into the FDA, through those regulators, through other partners that they work with. And the FDA works extensively with other groups and organizations, consulting firms, other types of things out there that help them to develop new plans, review the activities that they're doing on an ongoing basis, and help them to evolve. So it's looking at where those routes are that we can evolve, I think will help regulatory agencies globally to understand really what is happening there and how to get them to make sure that we're all at the same place at the same time.
Yeah, and this could be a great role for the NSF ERC. It could be a great role for the Manufacturing Innovation Institutes, in particular NIMBL, Biofab, to jump in as well and interact through a public-private partnership with FDA, for example, to be able to transfer this knowledge as well. Dawn, what are your thoughts?
No, I think it's a great idea to have representatives from the regulatory agencies, the FDA specifically, on the ERCs, so that they're following the research as it's still at the early stages and trying to think about what this might look like moving forwards. Also for the Manufacturing Innovation Institutes, I think it'll be critical because they're much further downstream than the ERCs are. I will say, for thinking about small businesses, now at NSF, when we fund a small business phase 1, we bring them all to a kickoff meeting. And most of these companies are less than 5 years old and have fewer than 5 people. So they're really baby startups. And we bring the FDA in at that first kickoff meeting before they're really even very far off the ground, so that the researchers and the small companies are starting to think down the road and not go too far before they get ahead of the regulation environment. So I think early engagement, partnerships is going to be very critical to make these things go. You're developing the research, you need to think about the regulation at the same time.
So I'll throw this out there. I think I know a little bit of the answer, but is there a group that's developing workforce training roadmaps in this space to help train and prepare new and existing workforce and learn each other's languages? And let's be specific to data science, AI in this industry. Don, you're smiling. So I know that
I was going to say, I don't know enough about this particular industry, any roadmaps that have been developed, but I will say that the ERCs that we fund, such as the one that Chris Roy is director of, they do develop curriculum for their students, and they also train the next generation of the workforce. So I think you could look to what the ERCs are doing in this space, and perhaps other large centers that are both educating graduate students and doing research at the same time, to think about what skills they're looking for in their research students to help develop the roadmap. That would be my pointer.
Yeah, John.
Well, I could say, from NIMBL's perspective, we've definitely funded, projects on the educational workforce side that are looking at, putting curriculum out there in, data modeling or automation and advanced analytics and that sort of thing. But I think you raised an interesting point that I don't know that there's anybody that's out there looking specifically at workforce needs around data analytics and systems, just this whole realm specific to our industry. And I think, it's a soapbox that I get on all the time about, the need for greater collaboration across, not just across institutes, but across funding streams and everything else to really look at this, because I do know, like at NC State, there's a huge center for data analytics. Other universities have huge investments in data analytics. They've got roadmaps general to other industries, not necessarily specific to our industry, but there's so much room, so much work that can be leveraged and easily applied, because my hunch is what we'd see in other industries is very, very much applicable to what we have going on in ours.
Yeah, and oh, sorry, Allison, go ahead.
I was just going to add that I think that I don't know of anything formalized in the sense that you were asking, but I agree that we have a number of training programs that are in this space, and we require of these training grants that they have specific and measurable goals in terms of outcomes for the students and what kind of skill set that they need to transition to the next level, and with a strong understanding of what the career pathways are for this group of scientists that they're training. And we really do hit a lot of the areas specifically relevant to this meeting. And so I think if you wanted to move towards that, it would be quite straightforward to bring together people who are already thinking quite a bit in this space.
So I'll just add that the reason I was sort of hinting at the beginning was, and I know Chris is probably itching to unmute and let everyone know that they were funded by NSF very recently in the future manufacturing cycle to develop a roadmap with Nexite Group in order to start looking at these workforce challenges specifically. Because in a way, although EWD is very much a part of what we do, what John does at NIMBL, and that NSF and NIH are funding these things, our mandates are just so broad, at least at the MIIs, and related to manufacturing writ large, that data is very much a component of it, but we can't dive in as much as we'd want to. And so I think that's really important. So I think
real quick, Tom, one thing to add on top of this, I think that's interesting. We talked about the FDA and how we can engage there and how we can engage with the staff as they're coming into their careers. I think one of the other things that we started to do at Janssen and at J&J is focus primarily on data science at this point, but started data science academies that aren't focused just on the staff that want to develop. It's also, I don't want this to be taken the wrong way. It's also focused on executives and the vice presidents and, C-suite officers and things along those lines within our organization, so that they can understand what the new and emerging capabilities are and systems thinking and things along those lines that people are going to be bringing and presenting to them, so they understand the overall value and they're able to speak the same language like Dawn was mentioning and you had mentioned. And I think as this evolves, that's going to be just as important, is that even if someone isn't becoming an expert within the space, that they're educated enough and have enough information and enough understanding of the methodologies and the approaches as they begin to replace the more traditional that they may have been familiar with for 10, 15, 20, 30 years within the workforce, that it's going to be something completely new. And, a lot of times we face that resistance possibly from the FDA as we view it in pharma. It's like it's something new and different, but it's not just there. It's also within all organizations as new and novel methods come up.
Yeah, and the C-suite and the executives need love too. And in part, it's sort of what I was saying at the beginning, which is they're going to hold the investors at bay saying, no, we need to do all this extra R&D at the front. I know you want to be in clinical trials right now. We'll do that, but along the way, we need to make sure we're collecting enough data and the appropriate data, right? So we have about 4 minutes left. So I'll just turn to the next question, which is what steps should be taken in the near term? So the next 1 to 3 years, what do we do in order to strengthen the workforce and prepare them for all of this?
I can start and just sort of reiterate something I started to mention, the last question, and that's, I think there's a need for more, to create more synergies across the different initiatives that are out there, meaning what you guys are doing at Army Biofab, what we're doing at Nimble, what the NSF is funding through, their various different initiatives, as well as what's going on at different universities and community colleges. I think I don't want to say everybody's working in silos, but there's so much potential for redundancy that I think if people were to start sharing ideas across, a lot more broadly, I think there's a lot of synergies that I think we could all build from.
So I'll agree with that, because I think the workforce is too big, right? There's the PhDs, there's the existing workforce that needs new training, there's the technicians. All these different levels are important, and they all really need to be addressed at some form. And so I agree, trying to do an inventory of what's going on, and maybe that's something that's coming out of the ERC, the CMAT. But I think trying to think about what are the needs and what are the opportunities. And that's the kind of thing where NSF is really happy to help host a workshop that would bring people together. Obviously, you've had this little session on workforce over this 2-day workshop, but I think it sounds like there's a lot more opportunity to expand this little session into a much longer workshop and understand what exists, where are the gaps and the needs. And so that would be my suggestion.
You're muted, Tom.
I was just calling on you, sorry.
Has to happen every session, so.
Yeah.
So some ideas from my perspective too. I think everything that Dawn and John had said kind of is perfectly aligned with my thinking too. I think one of the things we can do that's helpful is raising the awareness that people have of systems thinking, of data science, of analytics, of AI and ML and everything along those lines, how it impacts their day-to-day and bringing that to the next level, so that it's not just something that you go to Google and do, but that it's here's how it impacts your everyday life. And I think the workshops so that we can identify this are an important part of that, but it's also bringing that in within industry, at least, having symposiums internally. We started doing data science symposiums that bring together our entire organization so that people both within data science organizations and outside of it can see the impacts that data science has, that systems thinking has, that new ways that we're doing work come together. And that piques the interest of a lot of our younger staff for them to want to be involved in that. And to look for other avenues where they can get training, where they can figure out how to integrate that with the work they're doing on a day-to-day basis, even if it may not be readily visible how that happens right now. And that's really where the innovation and the novel usage of some of these technologies and approaches come up. So we're continuing to do that. We think it's been incredibly successful so far. I think it's starting to happen much broader as well. And it's going to be a key for us to be able to be successful in getting the workforce that we need.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't know how this has happened, but we are at time. I always love to throw a little bomblet into the end of this, just for further thought. We don't need to discuss it today, but what all of this discussion piques for me is, how does this impact workforce training more broadly? So How do we train in the regulatory sciences to take all this stuff into account? What about quality systems, validation? If we have AI running some of this automation, and if that's even possible down the road, how's that going to impact the way QC is done? It's not going to be chemistry, it's going to be watching sensor data. You know, how does validation get done? Is that going to change? And so I'll just leave it with that, food for thought, and thank all of you for participating in this important panel this afternoon. And at this point, I will turn it back to Anne and Krish. Thanks.